The following is a presentation of the Mat Talk Podcast Network.
What came first, the chicken or the egg? That philosophical debate is often cyclical and can border on theological, scientific, or even emotional. With college athletics, you usually need the egg first. Logic, which hasn't always been present within athletic departments at the Division I level, is often the last thing considered. So when trying to start a Division I wrestling program at Little Rock, what did come first, the chicken or the egg? Or was it the most important thing in college sports, the money? I'm Hall of Fame wrestling writer and broadcaster Jason Bryant. This is Rocked Up, a story about the foundation and formation of a new college sports program at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. We left off last time talking to some of the players who helped get wrestling at least in the conversation at the high school level in Arkansas. Today we'll meet with Greg Hatcher again. We'll talk with David Bazzel and see what his impact was on starting wrestling in Arkansas. And we'll also talk to some of the people that were getting things rolling and getting things towards sanctioning here at the high school level. Today we find out which did come first, the chicken, the egg, or the money.
David Bazzel. I am a co-host on a morning radio show, Sports Talk Show, 103.7 The Buzz here in Little Rock. And amongst other things, I promote college football. Created some college football awards that are presented here on a local level and nationally as well. So spent a lot of time talking about sports and promoting sports.
Arkansas's football crazy, and David's got a pretty good gig here in Arkansas. So when you want to get the word out to sports fans in Little Rock, this is the guy you talk to. Here's why.
I'm from Panama City, Florida. That was recruited by Lou Holtz back in Arkansas in the early 80s and got to play in those early 80s with some great football players. A couple of my teammates, Steve Atwater, played with the Broncos. And loved him. Yeah, great. He was a big hitter. Wayne Martin, who had a great career with the Saints, and Billy Ray Smith, amongst others. And got to play against guys like Bo Jackson in one of the bowl games we played in, and Eric Dickerson at SMU.
Bazzel's a guy that loves his job. He's good at it. He's an eloquent speaker. He's a lot of fun. And he's just got this voice that people will listen to on sports radio stations, as he said, in Central Arkansas. But one thing that Bazzel had going for him that a lot of people in Arkansas didn't, he was actually familiar with the sport of wrestling.
Well, it's interesting. Growing up in Florida, Jason, wrestling was pretty big in the Panhandle. And when I played, I was a first-team All-State linebacker, but I'd always had an interest in wrestling. But I was always afraid of dropping weight. I wasn't a very big guy anyway, so that was the thing that sort of kept me away. But all my buddies wrestled, so I had a knowledge and awareness about wrestling because I grew up there in Panama City. And when I got to Arkansas, I thought it was interesting that there was no wrestling here, no wrestling in high school. So one of the things I had begun was a state high school weightlifting meet. They had never had any high school weightlifting competition. And so where I'm from in Florida, we had state wrestling, we had state weightlifting. So I spent, now I think it's in its about 30th year, I sort of put together a statewide meet in qualifying. And so, I guess at that point I was doing a lot of promotion, doing television as well. I was a weekend anchor for the NBC affiliate. So I was connected to all the media outlets and doing radio. And Greg Hatcher came to me, and Greg and I had worked on the Broyles Award. I created the Broyles Award that goes to the top assistant coach in America every year. And so he had been involved with the Rotary that had helped support that. And so he had sort of seen me, promote the different things that I do. And so he came to me and said, "Hey, listen, I'm thinking about starting wrestling in Arkansas." And I just said, "Listen, I think it's great. I think it's a great sport, and it's hard for me to believe they don't have it." So basically, he just approached me and said, "Can you help me if I sort of put this together? Can you help me get some attention on it and set me up a press conference, do all those things?" And so that was basically it. And if you know Greg, and I think you've already spoken with Greg, Greg's a get it done kind of guy, and he's like me. If we're going to do it, you want to do it first class.
And as Bazzel explains, even he was surprised by what Greg Hatcher was offering.
So fortunately, Greg has been successful enough financially and in his business that when he has an idea, he can bring a lot to the table. And so once he told me that he was going to say, "Hey, listen, I'm going to help these schools get their mats," he's like, "Okay, you are going to get it done. You're going to be successful." So I was glad to be able to, I think, the first press conference we had, I think it was over at one of the high schools, and got all the media out there, and he had a mat and had wrestling going on, on the mats. And of course, his background, he also was a wrestler. So it was a really easy sell to all my friends in the media. because, if I'm saying, hey, listen, this guy's legit. And because really Greg had not really, even though he'd been a super successful businessman, he had not really done a whole lot of high profile sports things. He was building his Bluebird, giant city out there by his house, but it wasn't to where it is now. And so, people really didn't know Greg as well. And so once he made that announcement, that got everybody's attention. Wait a minute, this guy is so passionate about wrestling. He's going to pay for every mat.
One of the benefits of wrestling is the startup costs are pretty limited. You need a mat, some equipment, and a place to practice. But sometimes the dollar figure with a wrestling mat might be a little bit of sticker shock because, according to the wrestling mat manufacturers around this country and around the world, a wrestling mat starts at about $10,000. And Greg's going to buy a lot of wrestling mats.
At the time that I did it, I had not sold my company. I did not have the money to buy 40 wrestling mats at $10,000 each. One of the funny things is I have a friend, Rush Harding, who said, there's people that can give money till it hurts. He goes, but the deepest level of giving is when you go borrow the money and give it away. Because he's had to do that a couple times on projects, and he taught me that. So I literally borrowed all that money. I didn't have a penny of it. So I went to the bank and borrowed the $400,000, to get wrestling started. Now, as it turns out, the more you give, the more you get back. It just kind of works out that way. 12 years later, somebody walks in and tries to do a deal with me that was a win-win for everybody. And they do a private equity deal with my agency. I still run it. I still own stock in it. I have my kids and my son-in-law is here with me. I'll be working here 25 years from now. But, then I was able to pay everything off and do a lot more, for the community later.
The sport finds people in various ways. For Greg Hatcher, it was because his dad was a professor that took away his basketball dream and introduced him to the sport of wrestling.
I was a college professor brat. There's Army brats. I was a college professor brat. So I would have never been a wrestler had my father not kept moving, because I was a basketball player in Kansas. And when they moved to Missouri, it was too late for me to make the basketball team. When I couldn't get on the team, that about 3 days later, they had a shoot, pass, and dribble. Those kind of like the punt, pass, and kick. And I beat all the basketball players and took first, but I couldn't make the team. So that next week in gym class, we had wrestling. And there were 8 guys in my weight class, and I took 7th out of 8. And within a couple weeks, I beat that number 1 guy and was the starter at 98 pounds. So I wasn't a real big guy then, but I grew later. So that's how I ended up getting into wrestling, is because of the moves, or I would have played basketball.
But unlike so many salesmen, where there's a pitch and then there's a payoff, the payoff for Hatcher wasn't just financial. Matter of fact, he was borrowing money to give money away. For Hatcher, it's the benefits that a sport like wrestling can give to his new home. It can give to kids, and the opportunity to give the state of Arkansas. As you hear him talk, this is a sales pitch, but it's also something he honestly believes in. And it's a lot easier to sell something you believe in than something you're just simply trying to sell.
I came from the North, so the South, everything's football, basketball, not even, baseball that much, but just football crazed. I mean, I've tried to do a lot of things in my life, community service wise. Nothing even touches, the wrestling, because we've had kids that were in trouble that wrestle and it gets them out of trouble. We've had kids that, there's no sense doing drugs, or eating bad when you're wrestling, right? I mean, when you're wrestling, you're having to make weight. Are you going to waste calories on stupid stuff? You're going to learn to eat right. You're not going to be out drinking at night, before you have to wrestle. It cleans up a lot of things. And I've gotten a lot of heartfelt letters from parents where this just fit their kid. Maybe the guy was a little guy. He couldn't play on the football team very well. He wasn't, big enough for basketball, but wrestling changes his world. It gives him hope and confidence and swagger that he could never have anywhere else. I think that more than anything else, the fact that it benefits everybody regardless of size, is what makes a difference. And one thing I learned, I started as a 98-pound wrestler as a high school freshman. I wrestled at 158 in college. I've never feared people because of wrestling. If I saw a 250-pound guy and he wasn't a wrestler, I'd feel like I have a chance. I just like what it does for kids. And when I was selling the schools on it, I'm like, this sport will change your kids. And so parents have seen that and felt that.
And where's another hook? In Arkansas, it comes back to pigskin.
Sometimes I tell the football coaches, those little guys that you think are too small to play D-back as a ninth grader, when they're 170 as a senior and they've had that wrestling toughness built into them, that's the difference between winning a state championship in football and not winning one. So the smart football coaches have figured that out too.
Package all that together with a guy who's good at what he does and a list, again, dangerous combination.
Well, I'm a salesman. That's what I do for a living. I sell insurance, so I'm pretty good at explaining a situation. If I believe in a situation, I'm pretty dangerous because I'm going to be passionate about it. But, the facts are on our side. What's not good about wrestling? What's not good about learning, weight control, learning self-defense, learning discipline, being in a situation where nobody can bail you out. Okay, what's not good about that from a confidence perspective, for kids? We've got obesity growing in the United States, and nothing burns more calories than wrestling. So why not do that in high school? In the South, you have 15 guys on a basketball team, on a varsity basketball team from 9th through 12th grade. Wrestling is a winter sport. People are sitting around doing nothing. We need them out there working out. I've seen it change kids' entire bodies. Some little frumpy kid comes in and leaves, cut up and confident. It happened over and over and over.
And again, you can take a salesman's word for it, or you can take a wrestling coach and a parent's word for it. Here's Don Schuler. We met him in episode 1.
I could tell you of just in Bentonville alone, kids that went from being, little short squatty butterballs to being just super strong, muscular, in shape kids that eat right and everything. Both of my sons gave up caffeine, anything with caffeine in it, 15 years ago because of wrestling.
Pretty safe bet this show won't be sponsored by any energy drinks or soft drink companies or soda or pop, if that's what you call it. The fact that Arkansas ranks amongst the worst in the country in terms of childhood obesity. Wrestling is a natural fit for an area that desperately needs activity. There needs to be more opportunity. And that's where Carter Lambert also took notice.
Well, my name is Carter Lambert. I am the president of Central Arkansas Christian Schools. We're located in North Little Rock, Arkansas. It's kind of centrally located in the state. And I've been the president there for the past 17 years.
While Bentonville had a club team up in northwest Arkansas, Lambert and his school were the first to really take a leap of faith, pardon the pun, in starting wrestling at the high school level.
I believe that we were the first school that Greg Hatcher contacted and talked to about participating in wrestling in the state. And I think we were the first school that said yes.
When asked how long it took Greg Hatcher to get Carter Lambert to say yes, give or take 30 seconds.
A lot of that is due to my respect for Greg, both professionally but also personally. Because I knew him on a personal level, I knew what a big part wrestling had played in his life and his development. And so I wasn't unfamiliar with wrestling at the time. But one of the key words that when Greg started talking to me about it was he talked about opportunity. And to me, that was so consistent with our mission as a school. We really believe we want our students to be involved. And the more activities that we can do that give students opportunity to put into practice the things we're trying to teach them and the values, and just to be a part, that was so aligned with our mission as a school that I thought, yes, that we want to do that.
For a place like Central Arkansas Christian, where a faith-based institution can throw that term value around, you don't hear Lambert talking about the values in the sense of theology or religious teaching. It's there, but it's not the driving focus. It's about the values of human toughness, perseverance, and all these reasons are factors in why he felt his school was perfect to introduce a wrestling program.
There were parts, though, to it that were unique. I felt like that wrestling and my understanding of the attributes that students have to display to wrestle and the things I'd seen over time, I thought it was a good fit with our school, too. Values of hard work. I also like the fact that in a society where it's difficult for people to take responsibility for themselves sometimes, one of the key components of our mission is trying to inspire independence. And I love that about wrestling. When you get out there, it's you and nobody else. And you can't blame your teammate. You can't blame anybody. And that's an incredible opportunity. Now, wrestling's not the only activity that does that, but it does it in a real unique way.
Up in Bentonville, Bill Dessler and Don Schuler had a club team rolling, and they were encountering some of the growing pains even before Greg Hatcher made that phone call to Central Arkansas Christian Schools. As Coach Dessler put it, he had a lot of pro wrestling fans coming out for sport that they expected to see ropes, turnbuckles, maybe even some face paint.
Down by Angle and Rikishi. Rikishi propping himself back up. Look at this. Look at Kurt Angle. This is a different...
In fact, in Arkansas, it might be safe to say the only reason people might have heard of Kurt Angle is because of his time in professional wrestling, and not because of the Olympic gold medal he won in freestyle wrestling in the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta. It's true.
Some of them thought they were coming in and thought there was going to be a turnbuckle and they could jump off the top rope, and I had to explain to them, no, this is a different type of wrestling. That's not what we do.
And while Hatcher was making more phone calls and getting people on board with wrestling, Coach Dessler was using good old elbow grease to start from the ground up before there was even a sanction. In many ways, Bentonville was serving as the blueprint for schools that were thinking about starting wrestling but had nothing to draw from. If one was to write a book about this situation, you'd probably call it Wrestling on a Budget for Dummies at your local Barnes & Noble.
To get the administration on board, which the principal at the high school at that time, his name was Jacoby, I went to him and he said, he signed off on it. He looked at me and said, if you have all the T's crossed and I's dotted, and I did, he said, we'll let you have the club. Then it was the athletic director that we had to work with. A lot of it's ignorance, not knowing anything about wrestling, the culture. Coming from Nebraska, I knew the culture.
Bentonville wasn't the only team in existence. Matter of fact, when wondering who would Bentonville wrestle against, there were a few teams. Unofficially, of course.
We really started, there was a school in Little Rock School of the Blind. They had been wrestling for years and years and years and years. And they would go to other states and wrestle schools of the blind in other states. And they would go across the border into Tennessee and into Missouri and wrestle. There was a youth club in Russellville. Terry Davis was the head coach of that, and he worked with high school students. They would do things around. Down in Glen Rose, the coach there named Doug McGuire, he and his kids were around and about. We had a team in Fayetteville. We had a team over in Rogers. We had a team here in Bentonville. That's kind of the roots of it from this incarnation. And we would wrestle with each other. One of our first things we ever did was we took our kids up to Missouri State University, and our kids wrestled with a club there that was comprised of college students that were wrestling on campus. And it was kind of neat to see them interact with the college students, and they went up there and they did pretty good against them. We had it real lucky up in Northwest Arkansas because we could go across the border and wrestle teams from Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma fairly easily. Once we got into the actual high school sport, that really made things boom up here. In fact, a lot of our state champions have been from Northwest Arkansas, Springdale, Bentonville have been state champions quite a bit because of the ability to go across the border and get such good talent. We had that program, that club program, and we actually had our first state tournament was held in Bentonville. It was 2 years before the Little Rock tournament started, 2 years before we became an actual sanctioned team sport in the state of Arkansas. But we had a lot going on for us up here, and it was good competition, bred good competition.
When the team decided to go into neighboring states and actually get competition from Missouri and Tennessee and Oklahoma, well, a little wrestling parent ingenuity came into play.
When I first started wrestling, I actually met a guy and his son, and they were from Iowa, and his son had wrestled a little bit, and his dad had been around wrestling, and they actually helped me the first couple of years, and he got his bus driver's license, and if we'd go somewhere, he would drive the bus.
While it's not unique to wrestling, coaching is often an underpaid experience. Budgets be what they may. How do you negotiate for a coaching stipend in a sport that's not even officially sanctioned? It's like, hey, can you give me money for something that we actually don't represent our school in officially? Tough sell. So naturally, wrestling coaches work for about 25 cents an hour because they love the sport.
Finding coaches, of course, I did it for free for I don't know how many years. People didn't want to pay for it until we were sanctioned, and then still they didn't understand the time, that you put into wrestling. Some of the schools in our area, they still wouldn't pay their coaches, and if they did, it was $500 for a season, which looking back, I didn't really do it for the money. I mean, I was in it for getting the program started. Really, my son would have something. As the years went by, it became more for the, for the kids, because, you're invested in the kids and in their, not just their time in wrestling, but in their life.
Up in Little Rock, Carter Lambert had the same type of problem in finding coaches, only he didn't have a Don Schuler or a Bill Dessler around his school system. He reached out another way.
Well, I think for us that even when I talked to our AD at the time, Doug Kilgore, Doug had to deal with the reality of trying to find coaches. We're a school about around 1,000 students at the time. Whenever we add activities, we have to have personnel to provide leadership in those programs. And so, that was initially, what are we going to do? We struggle right now. We were very fortunate that I had a guy I like to call a character guy, Keith Allman, who was involved in our athletic program, primarily in football at the time. I went to Keith and I said, Keith, I know you don't know a lot about this, but I think you're the right person for this. He had sons that were in that age group, and I think it appealed to him that way too. And he just embraced it. We were able to take advantage of the opportunities that Greg and the group that was promoting wrestling provided. And, of course, Pat was a big help, Pat Smith. So that probably would have been the biggest concern going into it. And from our perspective, God really answered our prayers with that. Keith immediately embraced the sport and had a lot of success. We have been fortunate since it's become a sanctioned sport. I believe we won 3 state championships, and with a school our size, with 2 divisions, we're very proud of that, and that's attributed to Keith's leadership and the fact that he was able to check off one of those boxes for us, have somebody come in and do it.
So as schools start adding, 3 years go by, we have 3 quote unquote club state tournaments, and then it's time the sanction comes in. We have a high school state wrestling tournament. We are going to have the first state champions officially in Arkansas wrestling history. The announcement came in June of 2008.
When the first couple state tournaments we had were high school tournaments. I mean, they were like basically your average high school tournament. You go in and it's hospitality room for the coaches and a snack bar and that's about it. Greg is probably the best thing that could ever happen to a high school wrestling in the state of Arkansas. Greg likes it to be huge, and he wanted to grow the sport. He wanted it inclusive, and he wanted it set up to where it was kind of like the college championships. And so we had to have Sandy and AL in here, and they couldn't be better for the sport in the state.
The voices of Sandy Stevens and A.L. Hayslip have been the backdrop for wrestling tournaments around the world for the last 30 years. Matter of fact, Sandy's first NCAA wrestling tournament she announced with the late, great Ed Aliverti back in the 70s. Sandy's the first lady of wrestling. And to have her as the voice of the first Arkansas State tournament was a big deal.
My name is Sandy Stevens. I'm a wrestling announcer, and one of the events I have been delighted to do for the last decade or so is the Arkansas State Championships held in Little Rock. And we've been able to see A.L. Hayslip, the other announcer, and I have been able to see and participate in the growth of wrestling in the state, in high school, when there was virtually none a little over a decade ago.
Since the 70s, wrestling greats have heard this woman call their name. She's announced dozens and dozens of NCAA wrestling championships, the voice of the Olympics in 1984 and 1996. She's worked world championships and the USA Wrestling Cadet and Junior Nationals since its inception, save 1 year. If you are anybody in wrestling, this woman has said your name. So how does a Hall of Fame voice end up announcing the very first Arkansas High School State Wrestling Championship, at least officially? As you may have gathered, the wrestling community is pretty tight-knit.
Well, I think A.L. was the first one contacted because he knew Greg Hatcher. And then A.L. said to me, Sandy, would you be interested in this? They're interested in having us both because of the growth. You know, they see this growing and they want it to be number one event. Greg wants to do things the best way he can possibly do to make this a great experience for the fans, for the wrestlers, for the coaches, and for the volunteers.
So that's why Sandy Stevens showed up in Little Rock. But Sandy always sees things a little differently. She's been a journalist for a long time as well. So when she sees what is unfolding in Little Rock, it speaks to her not just as an announcer, but as someone who's been involved in wrestling and been there and done that and seen it all 4, 5, 6, 7 times over. The only difference with this is something she'd never seen because no one had ever seen it.
This one has been a lot more personal because it was small, because it was limited in number. I think we got to know the wrestlers, the coaches, the parents, the fans, and as I mentioned earlier, the volunteers that you don't normally do in the first of anything like the National Junior Freestyle Championships, for example. Yes, you get to know some of them, but this was small enough that we really became part of this wrestling family. And to be able to see that family grow over the decade has just been terrific. And to see the appreciation for the sport, for the wrestlers, for the coaches, for the volunteers, it takes a lot of work to put on a state tournament. But the people there appreciate it, and they're excited about it. They want it to grow in their state. They really are hooked on this sport, which is, of course, what we love to see.
As we close the chapter on high school wrestling and its birth in Arkansas, we now turn the page for the rebirth of college wrestling in Arkansas. As you heard in episode 1, there was at one time a college wrestling program at Arkansas State. Didn't last very long. But now, in the new era of college athletics, who's going to be the one? Who's going to be the first? And how will Greg Hatcher have an impact on those programs?
Well, Greg Hatcher is enthusiasm personified. I mean, he's a quiet person most of the time, unless his team is out there on the mat. he cares about getting things done. He is so dedicated to this sport. He was elected as an outstanding American at the National Wrestling Hall of Fame a couple of years ago, and he was so deserving of that because of everything he has done for the sport, and he's done it quietly.
It's been exciting to watch that grow over the years. I mean, to see it start from nothing, but what he was able to do, he was able to get it sanctioned by the Arkansas Activities Association. To be able to start something from scratch, be able to penetrate the Activities Association, Arkansas being one of the last states in the country to have high school wrestling, which was a stunner. And so it's really cool. And now to see him progress into college, I'm not surprised by that, but he's a dynamo. He's a dynamo, and it's been. I was proud to play a little bitty part in that.
So what was it? What came first, the chicken or the egg? Or was it the money? With high school wrestling well on its way in Arkansas, the next step was college wrestling. On the next episode of Rocked Up, we'll find out how Greg Hatcher and company were again making phone calls, beating down the doors, and finding out how to get collegiate wrestling started in Arkansas. Rocked Up is a presentation of the Matt Talk Podcast Network and can be found on the web at getrockedup.com or on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or wherever fine podcasts are found. For more wrestling-specific podcasts, check out MattTalkOnline.com. If you like the show and want to support it, leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/MattTalkOnline.